Hello and welcome to the February 2022 edition of Staying Global While Staying Home. I'm the CEO of the Newcomb Global Group, Lucy Newcomb, and I'm also your host today. And with me, I have the great pleasure to introduce Cheryl Miller Van Dyke, head and founder of the Digital Leadership Institute International. Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're so pleased to have you. And Cheryl is a global business leader like the rest of us, but she's also in somewhat of an observer mode because, as I mentioned, she founded the Digital Leadership Institute quite some time ago. And so part of why I invited you here today, Cheryl, in addition to knowing what a fabulous insight provider you are, is you're in quite a unique position of being almost an analyst, as so many of our guests have talked about the incredibly, pressing need to accelerate digital transformation. And you've been doing that for over a decade and, kind of in it yourself and then helping others to do that. So I thought we could start with just a very broad view of what you've observed with businesses as a Brussels-based business, but now also Washington, D.C. based yourself, what you've observed in the last 2 years or so with businesses and adoption around digital issues.
Oh, wow. How much time do you have, Lucy?
For you, lots, but we might have to do a part two.
My pleasure. Let's start where we can with the last 2 years. Yeah, that's a lot of the main thrust of the work that we do as the Digital Leadership Institute is about inclusive digital transformation. And like you said, I've been working on this topic for over a decade, but really from a macro societal perspective. What is the digital transformation? How is it impacting society? And who is at the greatest risk of being left behind? So, and when we dig down into those numbers, we know that there are certain populations that are especially vulnerable. Women, that's no matter where we are in the world, women are less likely to have access to digital technologies. We are more likely to have low or no digital skills. We are far less likely by a factor of almost 10 to found a digitally driven or even a digitally enabled startup. So, women as tech founders. As one of the key indicators that I've always watched, especially from the European perspective, because they collect really good data on this, is the number of women IT professionals in the workplace. And what we've seen is, despite this enormous increase in demand for IT experts who are really at the intersection of, innovation and entrepreneurship and the business of, not even the business of the future, but the business of the present. So the intersection of innovation and technology, we just don't have any women. In fact, today in Europe, there are as many women tech professionals as there were perhaps 12, 13 years ago, or even longer, which is terrifying, because that means that this whole skyrocketing demand, that which is being filled predominantly by men. And that's not a bad thing per se, but it does create this risk of exclusion. And that's just where we have data. But looking more at the micro perspective, so you can imagine then when we are faced with an accelerated digital transformation, which the coronavirus pandemic has thrust upon us, that those same vulnerable communities are disproportionately impacted, or may not even be reached at all. So to your question, Lucy, yes, we have all been forced to undergo a very steep learning curve as far as, the digital transformation is concerned. And I always ask myself, at what cost? Of course, we're all amazing adapters. This is part of the human genome, we
Right.
adapt well. I think especially about women having adapted during the pandemic, leaving the workforce in droves, overseeing the home, routine that is work from home, school
Mhm.
from home, and all the rest, and doing that. Given those factors that I described, that we are less likely to have the skill set to do it to begin with, but having accomplished that, I mean, in some senses, like I said, I wonder what the implications for that are, and I really only have anecdotal information, but we do know, for example, that women made up 51% of the American workforce before COVID, and now make up 35% of the workforce. So you see this disproportionate leaving of jobs outside the home for money by women. Um, and then, I'm curious about what this means in terms of the burden, of doing everything remote, of doing everything online, what that learning curve has involved. And that's for the lucky ones of us who have been able to kind of manage that shift, or have options. And I often reflect about those same vulnerable populations that that we try to reach with our work. For example, our beneficiaries who are struggling to have even access to technology, maybe minimum digital literacy, they're not even on the radar right now. So that's highly troubling for me, because we're also trying to reach them, and yet our opportunities for reaching them have been decreased, because this is exactly the challenge that they are facing, that they don't have access, they don't have digital skills. So we can't be expected to be able to reach them through those very same channels.
Right. We also specialize in emerging markets. So those problems that have been there from the beginning, we in the United States are so used to free internet. Those with exorbitant
Ubiquitous.
telecoms costs and who don't even have access to a telephone, let alone an internet broadband, clearly exacerbated. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because viewers may be wondering, what does that have to do with global business? But actually, the frustration that you're mentioning is got to be the same frustration that many consumer goods companies are facing. We're more B2B, business to business, in our work, but a lot of our clients and others obviously are going right to the consumer, right to the customer. We now have D2C, direct to consumer. If you have an e-commerce business and you used to sell to those people, kind of problematic from what you're saying.
Well, what is very promising actually in that area of discussion. So when we look at the emerging markets, when we look at at e-commerce in specific, I recently joined a panel discussion from the E-commerce Institute, which is a fascinating organization that I recommend everyone to look into. It's like a public-private partnership that is looking at this question of e-commerce, and do have initiatives reaching women in specific. And in fact, because of that transformation that we were talking about, there has actually been a significant positive change in terms of the number of women-led businesses that have come online in e-commerce from emerging markets in specific during COVID. And that, I would say, is one of the positive outcomes here, right? It was kind of a do or die scenario. So I think, one thing that I like to talk about is, what does a woman entrepreneur look like? And one thing that we don't talk about often is how often women become entrepreneurs out of economic necessity.
Right.
And this applies to quote unquote developed markets.
Right.
Sorry, as well.
Absolutely. That's why we
Yes,
have the growth in the United States. For years, we've seen upticks in women
yes.
entrepreneurship for those
Well,
reasons.
actually, Lucy, women entrepreneurs are the most dynamic part
Right.
of the American economy, but even of the global economy. So there's always a disproportionate number of women coming online with their businesses. And by online, I don't mean digitally online, but I hope, right, to a large extent now. But starting up, this has always been a driver of dynamism in the US economy. It's the same in Europe. But unfortunately, you measure what you treasure, and there is no optimization of this reality. And what I like to, how I characterize it is by looking at what happens to women in the workforce. And for the past decade that I've been following the question, and the work of McKinsey actually researching this topic has shown us that 80% of women are marginalized by traditional career paths in these developed markets. And then the question is, what happens to us, right? So it's the proverbial glass ceiling phenomenon, which, by the way, has not gone away. It is exacerbated, obviously, by economic downturn.
Right.
Yes. So when 80% of a particular, half of the working population is marginalized, and leaves the kind of the corporate work environment, the question is obviously, or it should be at least, what happens to them?
Right.
What happens to us, in fact?
Right. Absolutely. I look forward to that conversation with you. Coming back to global business, and thanks for those insights. Just because I know your time is so limited today, and I'm excited by all your topics. Have you seen in particular, either from the DC side or the Brussels side, any particular company navigating this well, any particular organization navigating this well, this pandemic, digital transformation, acceleration continuum? Have you happened to notice that? I know you work more macro in general.
Yes. The companies that, I can just give some general indicators. I would say clearly it's tech companies themselves who are doing well in this environment, and cybersecurity firms in particular, because, once you have all of your employees working from home, working remotely, then things like identity management and, having those infrastructures, the hardware and the software in place to be able to carry on your work from a remote location, and times thousands, maybe tens of thousands of employees. So, obviously the economies that have done better in this are the ones, like you mentioned, that have access, that have, high powered broadband and ubiquitous access. So it is a macro perspective, but it is also, it impacts the micro organization. So the ones that have done well are those that already had the leg up, and this is what we're concerned about. But like I said, there's also been, the fact that, for example, Amazon is plug and play. Organizations that have managed to plug into those opportunities that are out there, who are using the cloud, who have access to mobile telephony, who can do their, who have e-wallets and can do their banking and such using PayPal or whatever the local variant of that is. The ones who have brought those different opportunities together are clearly able to thrive. And then the question becomes, again, what has been our success at doing that? And in fact, some of these, like I said, more vulnerable populations, including in emerging markets, have been successful at those kinds of things. Anyone in particular? No, I can't really say. We do know also, until the recent downturn in the stock markets, we do know that the tech companies, not only because they walk the walk, so clearly they run their businesses the way that they are promoting the rest of the world should use their services. So it's in those two senses. They're the head of the curve, but they're also providing us those same tools. So cloud technology, mobile telephony, e-banking, and fintech. That's also been a really important enabler, I think, for leaders, for companies around the world. So the ones who have best taken advantage of those realities are the ones that are best suited to succeed in this environment, clearly.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that you had a leg in and a leg up. Well, we are closing our conversation with silver linings, and you mentioned one, which is the accelerated growth of women entrepreneurs. Are there any others that you have seen as silver linings, especially with some of your own initiatives? I know the DLI has a number of really interesting initiatives. Anything you've seen on a silver linings basis, as well as the women's entrepreneurship growth?
As far as silver linings, I have to say, when these, when we're confronted with really life-changing, even, species-changing phenomenon like we are right now with the pandemic, we have to look to the public sector to lead, in our growth, in our return to.
That's interesting.
Yes, return to a strong economy, seeing our way through recovery. And I've got to, give a hand to our European leadership, the, President Ursula von der Leyen, for example, of the European Commission, who has actually, besides saying this, the green and the digital transformation are the focus of Europe's return to a normal economy, she's also emphasized that this should be a fair and balanced transition. So I'm looking to the public sector for that kind of leadership to say, in the response to the digital transformation and this transformation that is going to continue, that we will make sure that everyone is on board. And when we have that kind of vision, then of course we are looking towards women in leadership, women as business leaders, as this very vital and very important change component, variable for ensuring positive digital transformation.
Well, yes, and certainly the Europeans have it would seem, although, I'm speaking of Ursula as well, a very united leadership and a united platform around this. Whereas in America, we have a very fragmented approach to the virus, to a number of things. Now, with the news last week of 7.5% annualized inflation, you think that people will start to kind of coalesce, although I'm not clear about that. But so we will see.
Europe is a patchwork. So, I mean,
right.
It is indeed a success that these priorities have been codified. So they've been, they're right. now built into the future funding programs for Europe. But in Europe, the same situation is, and there are always those who are trying to exacerbate our differences as well. And yes. I think in the US, those differences are more profoundly felt because there is a kind of common language. There's a common juridical and legal structure, and in Europe, this is not the case, But I think there's definitely an agreement about the social democratic ideal in Europe, which is, it's an experiment, and it's also being thrust into great question, especially during such economically difficult times. So it might look like it's coherent. And I expect and have seen European leadership on this topic, but do understand, especially looking at the situation with Ukraine and Russia right now, that the transatlantic partnership is very important. And even Absolutely. As Europeans, but also as an American, me being both, I look to the leadership of the US on topics of this kind as well.
Yes, I hope we will see them. Certainly some of the fragmentation, not to digest too far into a political conversation, but to elaborate on my comment, the fragmentation we were experiencing predates COVID, or certainly it did not arise with COVID. It was already happening politically, and I think it's just expanded into other areas of life by definition. But It's an interesting contrast. You know, Africa also, where I work a lot, could be very fragmented, still working on some of these things, where Omicron was discovered and is also being rectified. So LATAM similarly. And then meanwhile in Asia, we have these meteoric rise of free trade agreements that are expanding well beyond the region. So it's an exciting time to kind of watch these unification versus diversification, fragmentation dynamics. And
Yes,
digital connects them all, doesn't it? Digital really is the platform for even
it is.
identifying where things are at. I mean, we wouldn't even necessarily know how fragmented some of these scenarios are if we didn't have the unification of the digital platform.
That's so true. I mean, and where you can definitely make a correlation with, you know, those countries that do have better broadband and more ubiquitous service and economic growth, right? So there's a kind of one-to-one relationship. Are they on the radar? If they are, that's a good sign. If they're not, then we're, you know, we need to ask what's going on. And then when you look at the country level as well, same questions. So it's a very valid point, and it's also very interesting again to see who the players are. Who's, you know, the number one trading partner for Europe right now is now China. So
Yes.
you know, we talk about that transatlantic partnership, but this is also in evolution, and that applies to the Asian region as well. And having been a student of Asia, even of
Right.
Asian Soviet times, because that's how far back it goes. Um,
Yes.
I'm also very, you know, very intrigued by those dynamics, but it's kind of a situation of the more you know, the less you know kind of thing, you know, like,
Isn't it just?
yes, like we've seen these patterns, they've evolved, they've changed, they shift. Some of the underlying circumstances are intransigent, or they just keep, you know, they reformulate themselves a bit, but they kind of remain. And it's very interesting what this reveals to us about ourselves, right? And about us as global citizens now, which, like you said, is much more underscored, omnipresent because of this digital transformation, for sure.
Yes, it's interesting. And for time's sake, I didn't get the chance to elaborate about your background, but of course you studied in Tokyo and you have done work in Russia as well. So like me, you're a child of the world. And that's part of why we really wanted to talk with you today, not only for your incredible, incisive point of view about digital issues, but also your global perspective. So Cheryl, thank you for your
Thank
time
you
and
so much.
expertise.
My
Look forward to
honor. Love the chance to talk to you again, Lucy, and thank you for everything that you do too.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. I look forward to continuing all our projects and highlighting more of yours in the future, because as people continue to evolve, you know, whether folks like it or not, I think we might be in various stages of this for a while, and digital will only become increasingly important. And hopefully the same is true for perceptions of the great work you do at the Institute and some of your initiatives. So thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Our guest next month will be Mr. Deep Sengupta, who is head of DSG Global Trade Compliance. We'll be talking about some of the other side of the pandemic, supply chain, bottlenecks, free trade agreements, and so forth. And Deep is also my what's called denim partner in the G100 Global Trade USA delegation that I have the honor to lead. Please feel free to reach out if you're interested in hearing more about that. And thank you again for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about how to open markets overseas, please contact us at info@newcomglobal.com. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, evening, etc. Bye-bye.